All right, so in this section, we are going to look at how plants reproduce in dry habitats or dry environments. Okay. So we're going to look at life cycles, which is something you guys should already be familiar with because we went over them in lab, but we are going to review them in this lecture, as well as going over some new information. Okay. So life cycles of sexually reproducing eukaryotes serve several functions. They increase genetic variability, they increase the number of individuals, and they allow for the dispersal of those individuals into new habitats. So the three innovations that were critical for plant reproduction in dry environments were spores, because spores have a protective covering or coat that's called the sporopollenin, and this allows them to, or it prevents them from drying out. Okay. But because spores are also very lightweight and they're able to be carried by the wind, it allows for the dispersal of those spores into other um, suitable environments where new plants can grow. Okay, so spores is one of them. The other one is gametes, okay? And then the third one is embryos, because embryos that were retained and nourished by the parent plant. So fossilized structures of early plants contained a specialized reproductive organs called the gametotangia. Okay. So in stoneworts, the um, they also have gametotangia, but the gametotangia that found in land plants are a lot more complex. And the function of these gametotangia is mainly for its protection. So it allows for the gametes to stay protected, so it prevents them from getting damaged or from drying out. And it's present on all land plants today except for angiosperms. And that's because angiosperms have uh, other reproductive structures that have the same function as the gametotangia. Okay, so the gametotangia, if you're talking about the male, then it's called the antheridium or antheridia for plural. If you're looking at the female gametotangia, then that's the archegonium. So the antheridium is the one that produces sperm, and then the archegonium is the one that produces eggs. And these are analogous to ovaries and testes in animals. Okay, so you can see some diagrams. So the antheridia are the structures, and then inside, that's where you would find the sperm because they produce sperm. For archegonia, the whole thing is a structure here, and then inside each one of them are the eggs. So instead of just shedding the eggs and sperm into the water, as the early plants did, the land plants retain them. Okay? So, and that's different than things like green algae. So the zygotes of land plants, those begin development on the parent plant and form multicellular embryos that remain attached and that can be nourished by the parent plant. So being able to retain the embryo was a key event in plant evolution, and this allowed for the evolution of a group of plants that are called embryophyta, which translates to embryo plants. Okay? Phyta meaning plant. And so the retention of the fertilized egg in embryophytes is analogous to the pregnancy in mammals. So all the plants, all land plants undergo alteration of generations, where you have a haploid phase, that's the gametophyte, and you have a diploid phase, that's the sporophyte. So these two phases are connected by other reproductive cells, like gametes and spores, because the sporophyte produces the spores and the gametophyte produces the gametes. Alteration of generations doesn't occur in algal groups, most closely related to land plants. So it does occur in some, but not in not in the more closely related groups to land plants. In Coelochetes, stoneworts, and conjugating algae, the multicellular form is haploid, and only the zygote is diploid. So this suggests that the alteration of generations in land plants evolved independently of its other eukaryotes that also evolved early in history. So here's a diagram of the of the algae the algae that are closely related to land plants. So you don't have to know this life cycle, but it's just to show you the differences. Okay. So here only the zygote is diploid, and the adult is a haploid. So the alteration of generations always involves the same sequence of events. Okay, so that's why if you know um, a couple of the life cycles of certain groups, it would be a lot easier for you to learn others because really all you have to do is just change a couple of the terms around. Okay? The sequence of events is the same. So we start with the sporophyte, which is the one that produces the spores, the haploid spores. Okay, and that's done through meiosis because the sporophyte is diploid, so it's always diploid. And since you're going from a diploid to a haploid, you're changing the number of sets of chromosomes. So that's only done by meiosis. Okay, then so the sporophytes produce spores. The spores then develop into the gametophytes. The gametophytes will produce the gametes, and then the gametes will fuse during fertilization and form a diploid zygote. And then the zygote develops into a diploid sporophyte. Okay, so here's a life cycle for a horsetail. So if we start with the sporophyte, this is the multicellular diploid. Okay, that produces the spores, which are haploid. So this is done by meiosis. The spores then uh, develop into gametophytes, and the gametophytes produce the gametes, and then the gametes fuse through fertilization and form a diploid zygote, which then develops into a new sporophyte. In non-vascular plants, the sporophyte is small and short-lived, and it's uh, very dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. So these types of plants are considered to be gametophyte dominant. So that would be something like a moss. where the gametophyte is the leafy part of the plant. It's the one that's getting most of the energy from the sun, or it's producing its own sugars. And so the sporophyte that grows on top of the gametophyte relies heavily on the gametophyte. Okay. In ferns and other vascular plants, the sporophyte is much larger and it's also much longer lived than the gametophyte. Okay. And so these are considered to be sporophyte dominant. So things like ferns, club mosses, and horsetails. And so if you remember from lab, the fern that we saw, that's pretty much the sporophyte form. The gametophyte, you wouldn't really see it unless you really look hard, but you would need to put it under a yeah, you would have to look very carefully at the base of a plant, and maybe you would still see a part of the gametophyte, but usually you wouldn't be able to see it because they're really tiny. They're like a couple of millimeters in diameter. But the gametophytes of gymnosperms and angiosperms are even smaller than that. So those are microscopic. So you would need to use a microscope to see those. All right. So here's the life cycle for moss. Okay, so we start with the sporophyte. Well, here's the gametophyte, and then from the gametophyte, you have the sporophyte growing on top of it. So this is gametophyte dominant because usually most of the time that you see this plant is in the gametophyte form. When it's getting ready to reproduce, then it produces the sporophytes. So sporophytes release the spores, which are dispersed by wind. Okay. Then they develop into gametophytes. Okay. And then you have male and female gametophytes. So if it's a male, it'll have the antheridium. If it's a female, it'll have the archegonium. Okay. And then when those fertilize, okay, once they get wet, because these require water in order to allow the sperm to swim to the eggs. These are so that's why if you see here, the sperm are flagellated. So once the fertilization happens, the zygote grows inside the archegonium, okay, and then eventually develops into a gametophyte. And then we have the fern life cycle. Okay, so this is the sporophyte form. That's the one that through these tiny structures called the sori, if you look closely, they look like little dots. So they release the spores that are also carried by the wind. Okay, then once they settle, they'll turn into the gametophytes, which are heart-shaped. Inside of the gametophyte, you have both male and female reproductive structures. And then once it gets fertilized by another fern, because remember, it doesn't self-fertilize. It needs it requires sperm from another fern. So once it gets fertilized, or once the egg gets fertilized in the archegonia, then it starts to grow. Okay, so the new sporophyte will grow on top of the gametophyte, but eventually it'll overtake it. So once it keeps growing, the gametophyte is no longer needed. Okay. So the transition from gametophyte dominated life cycles to sporophyte dominated life cycles is really striking because it's a big change that plants made. And so some of the reasons why biologists think this happened was because they believe that the diploid cells um, allow for a better response to varying environmental conditions than the haploid cells can. Okay? And this would be especially true if an individual was heterozygous at many genes. Here you can see a close-up of a hornwort. Okay, so this is a non-vascular plant. So as you can see, majority of the plant is the gametophyte. That's the leafy part. The sporophytes are the ones that are shooting out, the thin structures. Okay, and then for the horsetail, well, you can't really see the gametophyte in this picture, but this would be the horsetail. The gametophyte, as you can see, it's only a couple of, or maybe you can't, let me lower the screen. It's only half a millimeter, or it's only a couple of millimeters in diameter. So not very big. Okay, so we'll pause here and then we'll continue on the next video.